Russia continues to test European and NATO's resolve. On Friday, 3 MiG-31s violated Estonian airspace, causing the country to call for NATO Article 4 consultations. This, of course, comes on the heels of the Russian drone incursion into Poland's airspace earlier this month, prompting the first use of NATO fire to down the drones and also prompting Article 4 consultations. So how much more is NATO willing to take before using decisive force to deter Russian aggression? Now, joining me to discuss is national security and foreign policy expert Mark Toth. Good evening, Mark. Great to see you, and thanks for joining us on World News Tonight.
Great. Thank you, Don. Great to see you.
Yes. Now, Mark, I read your latest piece in The Hill with John Sweet. Now, you two highlighted the partnership between Russia and China shifting from an ideological struggle against the Western-dominated world to one that is entering a more overt phase with these latest airspace violations in Poland, Romania, and since yesterday, Estonia. So where is this new global order headed, and what does that mean for the transatlantic alliance?
Yeah, Don, what we've long argued is that the world's been in this ideological third world war. It doesn't look like what Hollywood said it would look like. It's been more a death by 1,000 cuts. But those cuts are getting costlier now, as we've just seen both in Poland, where you had 19, some people have argued even 50 drones that was incurred in your airspace in September 9th. And then you had the flyovers in Estonia of the MiGs, and then the drones that also were in Romania. And so all of these things are coming together, and it's troubling. I mean, basically what we've argued is there's two competing continuums right now. One of these continuums is what was started by Trump by meeting with Putin in Alaska. Putin, whether Trump intended this to be or not, has taken that meeting as a green light to continue his attack on Ukraine, to try and to get NATO to stand down. We've seen that with the drone attacks, the flyovers, et cetera. And he's touting that they've got 700,000 troops on the ground fighting Ukraine. The hybrid warfare, just like you were reporting at the top of the hour, that's happening, most likely that cyber attack on the airport facility. All of those things are just green lighting him. Well, at the same time, to circle back to the core of your question, you've got China that's also basically saying, look, we have ideas to replace the Atlantic Charter as it once was conceived by Churchill and Roosevelt in 1941 when they met off the coast of Newfoundland. And they're doing that with something that's called the Global Initiative that dropped when they had people together for their 80th celebration of the end of World War II, where they really want to see the Global South replace that order. So kind of what we're seeing right now, what's happening in Poland and in Estonia and in Romania, and obviously Ukraine as well, is this conflict coming into close contact with each other. Your region now is kind of the ground zero of these competing global orders.
It is, and I'd say it's probably high time for the transatlantic alliance to be stronger than ever. But I think that's a little bit too premature at this moment. Now, after this latest incident in Estonia, in which Russian MiGs were in Allied airspace for 12 minutes with transponders switched off and no contact with air traffic control, is the NATO response by reacting actually deterring Russia, or is it inviting more such incidents?
Don, my own personal interpretation is that these are going to invite more unless NATO gets tough. They need to send a clear signal that if there are any more incursions of Russian drones or Russian fighter jets, such as this one, that just happened in Estonia, there were 3 of them, that potentially were carrying nuclear weapons. Look, they were equipped with Kinzels, and Kinzels can carry nuclear weapons. You could have had Tallinn, or Tallinn as some people call it, a city of 450, 500,000 people gone in a second. So these are the equivalent of acts of war, and NATO has to stand firm and say we're not going to put up with it anymore. The next time, whether it's a plane or whether it's a drone, it gets shot down. We've not seen that yet, and that's disappointing. It needs to happen.
It reminds me back in 2015 when Russia violated Turkey's airspace for just 11 seconds, a Turkish F-16 shot down a Russian Su-24. Now, earlier today we heard Petr Pavel, the Czech president, say that the next time a Russian aircraft violates NATO airspace, it needs to be shot down. As we saw back in 2015, there was no reaction. There was no war between Turkey and Russia. Do you think that this is the next response of NATO to prevent it from just being walked over by Russia?
Right. We can't ignore, Don, it's a great question. We can't ignore that a powder keg is building here that could explode. But I think it's only going to explode if NATO allows us to go unchecked. If NATO takes a firm stand right away and does what the Czech president was saying and basically shoot these things down if they cross into NATO airspace, I think that prevents that powder keg from happening, and that needs to happen. I'd go a step further. These are only happening because Putin thinks he has a green light. Obviously, my country needs to do more. Trump needs to push back against that. His statements to date haven't been sufficient in doing so. He's still sending green signals, whether he gets it or not, to Putin to keep doing more of the same. But I think NATO member states individually, a coalition of the willing, if you will, can do more. In these recent discussions, as an example, between Ukraine and Poland about doing a no-fly zone over Western Ukraine would help protect not only Ukraine, but obviously these drones especially from entering Polish airspace, Romanian airspace. And then obviously the same protections need to be presented and afforded to the Baltic states after seeing what happened to Estonia.
Absolutely, Mark. We've been arguing this for over a year now. Finally, it looks like it's on the table, which is encouraging. But I'd like to move on. George Barros from the Institute for the Study of War, a good friend of TVP World, well, he's called the Russian incursion into Poland's airspace by drones earlier in the month. He's called it an act of war. Do you agree with that assessment? Is it an act of war? And maybe Article 5 should have been invoked instead of these Article 4 consultations?
Look, George Barrow is a great guy. The Institute for Study of War is unparalleled in terms of their analysis of what's happening with the war in Ukraine. I do think it gets technical when you start bringing up these words like act of war. They have legal meaning in terms of international law. But I'll go as far as to say, look, I think George is right in the spirit of it. They certainly have the appearances of the act of war. And I think it's important that NATO respond accordingly to say, we're not going to take a chance. We're not going to let a NATO member state get attacked. And we're going to be diligent in shooting these things down. In terms of whether Article 4 or Article 5, I think Article 4 at this point is sufficient. It calls for consultations. Remember, for Article 5 to get triggered, it's got to be a material breach. I think we're getting there, but a material breach means that it's got to be dangerous in scope and scale. And as we saw back in 2015 with the shooting down that you referenced of the MiG-24 by the Turkish F-16, that wasn't deemed a material breach yet. But I think if you look at the totality of what Russia is doing in Estonia and Poland and Romania and in Ukraine, we're getting awfully close to that. And I think what Russia needs to understand is that Article 4 could quickly get escalated into an Article 5 type situation. So I think George is headed in the right direction, and he's certainly right to wave that flag, and Putin needs to hear that message.
Yeah, and it's the second Article 4 in just a couple weeks. Now turning the subject a little bit, I'd like to focus now on the recent sanctions that Ukraine has introduced on the Russian oil industry by attacking their refineries, knocking out their capacity to supply the international market and their own domestic market. Is this the best way to hit the Russian war machine? And when do you think that it's going to make a very visible impact on the war effort?
Yeah, Don, great question. Look, Ukraine is doing the best it can on the battlefields right now with the array of equipment, weapon systems, and ammo that they've got. But that's a static war for the most part. They are able to do counteroffensives. Zelensky just announced one as well. But they've got to find ways to fight Russia asymmetrically and more traditional ways of going after their oil and energy structure. They've done a masterful job at that. The latest estimates, and again, these are a little bit dated now, is that 17 to 18% of Russia's oil infrastructure has been affected. And if you take that out of the equation, that not only affects their war machine on the ground, causing them to have to prioritize oil and energy resources to them. It also affects their economy as a whole, creating domestic pressures, but also strain on their armaments supply chain in terms of continuing to feed this war. So Ukraine is doing that masterfully. And frankly, if Europe wants to find another way, in addition to this no-fly zone, helping Ukraine do more of those kind of attacks, giving them equipment like Taurus, et cetera, and the green lights to go ahead and use it as deep into Russia as they can. That's all good ways to make Russia pay a greater cost and change Putin's own personal cost about whether he should continue this war or finally end it.
Indeed. Well, we'll have to see exactly where this takes us. Mark Toth, U.S. National Security and Foreign Policy Analyst, thank you so much. It was great to have you once again here on World News Tonight. Thank you.
Oh, always a pleasure, Don. Good night.
And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for joining us and have a great evening. We'll see you next time. Good night.